Okay, so now we're going to move on to question 4, and this one says, existing isolated brook trout populations in Newfoundland, Canada were once part of a larger population that was fragmented at the end of the most recent glaciation period about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Researchers investigated 14 naturally separated stream populations of brook trout. They found that the populations are all genetically distinct and show differences in morphology. Okay, so it seems that we just had, some divergence of these brook trouts because of the separation of these streams. As a result, they're now different from each other. So A says, describe the prezygotic barrier that results in these genetically distinct populations. Okay, so there are several prezygotic barriers. There's a list of them that you go through in your, I want to say, an evolution unit, so unit 7. There's a couple different ones, but this one is fairly obvious, and it's like the one that is usually the case. So you can tell here that they were part of a larger population that was fragmented, and they're living in separated streams. So it seems like the reason that they are now genetically distinct is because they're in separate streams. Okay, so that's a very specific type of prezygotic barrier, and that's going to be geographic isolation. Okay, so describe the prezygotic barrier. So you have geographic isolation. So because they were geographically isolated from each other, they weren't able to breed, you didn't have the mixing of genes, they ended up being genetically distinct. So the key here is because they tell you that they're all in separate streams, okay? So geographic isolation, and then I'm gonna continue this on, maybe do a little bit more. Because it's asking you to describe, it's not asking you to list. So just be very careful when it says list versus describe. You're going to have to put a little bit more here. It says geographic isolation prevents gene flow. So that's how they became distinct from each other. They had no gene flow as a result of living in separate streams. Okay. B says, brook trout with longer fins are able to swim faster than brook trout with shorter fins. In one of the Newfoundland streams, the main prey of the brook trout evolved to move faster. For brook trout living in this stream, explain the differences in fitness between longer finned individuals and shorter finned individuals. Okay. So we have long finned individuals and short finned. The longer fins are better at swimming, so that offers them obviously an advantage. And in terms of this stream that they're living in, the main prey, so what the brook trout eat, have gotten faster over time, right? The predators are going to evolve and the prey are also going to evolve. So their prey has gotten faster. So would it be better to be the faster fish or the slower fish when your ultimate goal is to catch the prey, right? So to explain the differences in fitness, it's going to be due to the fact that, okay, the longer fins can swim faster. Longer fin trout swim faster. And again, this is just stated in the question. And because they can swim faster, the advantage that that gives them is that they can catch prey. Right? Their prey is moving fast, and so if they're fast swimmers, they can catch them, but the slower swimmers will not be able to catch their prey and will likely, not have enough food. So the longer fin trout swim faster, and this we can say allows them to catch food. Allows them to catch more food, and that's the fitness advantage. Okay, allows them to catch more food, and then ultimately, like the fitness advantage, you have to pass on those genes, right? So they're not just the advantage is, yes, that they can catch food, but ultimately their genes are going to prevail, and the long fin genes are going to be more present in the population because the ones that have longer fins catch more food, thus survive more, and then can reproduce. So I'm going to add that in just in case, because I think that's something that you had to mention. Longer fin trout swim faster, allows them to catch more food, and then as a result, survive and reproduce. You can say more often or more likely, something like that, opposed to obviously the shorter fin ones. Okay. Alrighty, so C says, if two morphologically and behaviorally distinct populations of trout remain isolated for many generations, predict the likely impact on both populations. Okay, so for C, they are morphologically and behaviorally distinct and they remain isolated. So this is kind of just asking you in general, if two species that, are slightly different from each other, remain isolated for a long time, what's going to happen to them? Okay, well, if they're not reproducing with one another, again, they're physically isolated from each other because they live in different streams, and then as a result, they're reproductively isolated. So they're not swapping genes back and forth. Since they're isolated from each other, the two groups are going to separate more and more. They're going to diverge farther from each other because they're not swapping genes, right? They're not intermixing those genes. They're going to become like farther or less, not less related from each other, but like their genes are going to become quite different. They're going to become distinct. So what I would put here, you can say that they will just become separate species or like diverge more. Oops. Become separate species / continue to diverge. Because it only says a couple generations, so you don't know for sure that they would separate, but they would obviously be more distinct from each other. Diverge. Again, you don't have to write all three of these. I'm just giving you options of different ways of saying the same thing. That's what happens to any, not just these brook trout. In this specific example, if you have two species that are geographically and reproductively isolated from each other, they will become, farther and farther away from each other and more distinct. Okay, our last one says, researchers claim that there are more genetic differences between two current brook trout populations than there are between any single current population and the ancestral brook trout population from which all the trout are descended. Provide reasoning to justify your claim. Okay, let's reread that. There are more genetic differences between two current brook trout populations than there are between any single current population and the ancestral brook population. Okay, that makes sense. So I'm just gonna, obviously you don't have to model this, but I'm just gonna model what they're trying to say here. So if this is, we'll do a little tree here. This, and then maybe like this. Okay, so this is the ancestor, and then, this is species 1 and species 2. Species 1 and species 2 are separate from each other because they were geographically isolated, right? What they're saying is that the researchers are stating that number 1 is more closely related to its common ancestor than it is to number 2, and vice versa. That 2 is more closely related to the common ancestor than it is to number 1. Okay, so why would that be? Why would, they be more related to a common ancestor than they are to each other? Okay, and again, this just comes down to the fact that they're geographically and reproductively isolated from each other. They're going down different paths. 1 and 2 came from this common ancestor, right? So there has to be, a very large deal of genetic information that's similar. However, they've now gone separate paths, and now they're starting to accumulate probably different mutations, different traits, different phenotypes, all of that. So for this one, you could say that each of those separate populations, so number 1 and number 2, are going to accumulate mutations, and they're not going to, the mutations that number 1 collects are not going to be the same ones as number 2, and they're also not going to swap them back and forth because they're isolated from each other. So if number 1 develops, I don't know, again, long fins, for example, number 2 is not going to get those genes because they're not interacting with each other. They could develop them separately, but again, they're not developing these traits because they're related to each other. They're now on a path of divergence, so they're getting farther and farther away from each other. However, they both still have that common ancestor. So basically the populations are going to have accumulated mutations. Let me just get rid of this. Okay, so the separate populations, so accumulate different mutations. So they're going to accumulate different mutations. You can also say like experience genetic drift. So because again, they're physically isolated from each other, and they're going to begin to like differ more. Diverge farther from each other. Okay. They're going to diverge farther from each other because they're in different streams. So depending on their streams is going to determine, you know, what makes something more fit versus the other, right? So stream that has number 1 in them might have different prey than number 2. It might be colder. It might, you know, have more algae, something like that. The conditions of stream number 1 and stream number 2 are different. And as a result, the 2 fish species are going to be adapted differently because they have different environments. The whole concept of evolution is you're adapting for your environment. If you have 2 fish species that are in different environments, they're going to adapt differently. Okay. I think that's all I want to say for this one. The second option that they allowed you to say was pretty much similar, like the same thing, is that there's, you know, selection by their local environment. Since their local environments are different, they're going to collect alleles that are unique. So diverge farther. So I'm also going to put, again, you don't have to put all of this. I'm just exhausting all the options. Collect different, what do I want to say? Collect unique alleles. We'll say that. Alleles due to different environments. Okay, so that is the end of D. So that was actually the end of 4. This one I feel like was pretty straightforward. This is definitely all within your ecology and evolution unit, so unit 7, unit 8. And this one's out of 4, so each one is worth 1 mark. Okay, that's number 4.